Okay. Hello. Okay, I'm trying to figure out where I need to look. I know I probably looked a little silly there for a moment. Just trying to get your attention. So, we're going to talk about some legal considerations for schools and how that relates to behavior. So, when students are at school, we've got this legal idea of that the school adults kind of are in place of the parent. Now, they don't have all the rights and all the responsibilities that a parent would have, but in addition to teaching academics, the idea in terms of the court is that they still have the responsibility to guide behavior, to support the students emotionally, to give guidance, and all of those types of things that go beyond all the things that teachers do that go beyond just talking about the curriculum. And because while students are at school, the school personnel are in loco parentis, all students, that's what kind of gives teachers and administrators the responsibility to enforce discipline. Now, there's this balance, right? Because the school not only has the right to have discipline, but they also have the responsibility to have discipline and to have an orderly school for all students to learn. And at the same time, students have rights. And at the federal level, we talk about constitutional rights of the 5th and the 14th Amendment. There are not that many federal laws pertaining to discipline. In fact, it's very hands-off. The Supreme Court has never said that corporal punishment is not okay. Many states, including Oregon, corporal punishment isn't okay, but in terms of federal law, that hasn't come down yet. So in general, it's pretty open. In terms of the students' protections, there are several things that sometimes conflict, like freedom of speech. Where does that search procedures often come up? We talk about locker searches and those types of things that generally kind of come into conflict, and trying to find that balance of individual students' rights as well as trying to maintain an orderly school. In terms of due process, there's two kind of areas. I have moved to slide 3 now, that we talk about due process, and one is procedural due process. And that's where certain procedures have to take place. And so that's kind of the logistical parts to it. When we think about short-term suspensions, students have to be notified. They need to know what it was that happened. They need to have the opportunity to respond and to say their side of it. This can be kind of informal for those short-term suspensions. When we get into longer-term suspensions, then the notice has to be longer. There are official hearings where the student can say their side of it. They get to talk to the witnesses on the other side. I know when I have gone to speak on behalf of my students before, or students that I've evaluated before at those hearings, and that's a much more formal process. They have to be well documented and written down. They can appeal. Now we can, when students are dangerous, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, when they bring a gun, when they sell drugs on campus, when they, do significantly body harm, like they really hurt somebody, we can remove them immediately and then have the hearing. So they're not in school while they're waiting for the hearing. But we have to have these kind of procedures in place that document things and that warn students, and that they kind of know that what's going on. Now, in terms of substantive, we talk a lot about procedural violations in special ed and then substantive violations in special ed. And this is where, when we think about how important education is, taking away somebody's access to education alters the trajectory of their lives. And when we talk about, in all of these cases, when we talk about procedural versus substantive, this is where what the school did is just wrong, right? Like so procedural, we get in trouble if they didn't follow the right steps. Substantive is really that we didn't have reasonable rules and consequences. There wasn't a careful rationale about why what happened. If the behavior didn't have any adverse effect on the school environment, then we can't have these big penalties. If the penalties aren't reasonable and fair. So substantive procedural violations are ones where we didn't follow the procedure. Substantive are where we did something that we really shouldn't have done. We didn't carefully consider what we were doing. And so because of all of that, we violated one of the student's rights. Okay, slide 4. So procedure due process, again, that's fair procedures, the fairness of the methods and the procedures for implementing the discipline. A lot of times I also kind of think in here, we need to document that we've done all of these things and that we did them in the right order. Substantive due process, the right to reasonableness, protection of students from violation of rights. This word reasonable comes up a lot in special ed law. We use it quite a bit. And it really goes back to the consequences that we're implementing in this setting. Reasonable goes back to reasonable rules, reasonable consequences. They're rational, they're fair, they make sense, they're related to the school setting, all of those types of things. Okay, page 6. So summary of due process protection. Again, rules must be clear. Rules must have a school-based rationale. A lot of times, a big part about rules is that students and parents need to know what they are. And this is why oftentimes at the beginning of the year, you'll have things where students have to sign that they have read and understand the handbook or the rules or those types of things. And that's one way that we protect ourselves in terms of due process, because we say the rules were clear, they knew what they were, and so that's something that we often do. Consequences are clearly stated and applied in a fair and consistent manner. This comes up quite a bit in special education because the way the laws are written, for the most part, special education students can be disciplined in the same manner that general education students can be disciplined in. When we get in trouble is if we're disciplining special education students in a different way than we are disciplining general education students. So, for example, if all of a sudden we tell a student with special needs that they can't go on a field trip because their behavior isn't very good, that would be a problem, because if that could be a problem if we don't have that same rule for general education students. So that consistency, that fairness, that's a lot of times kind of the crux of the issue. Okay, slide 7. So IDEA created a detailed set of rules and guidelines to ensure the appropriate education of students who are eligible for special education. We know that. And so a big part about discipline and what we're going to talk about here are that students need to have that access to school, and sometimes our discipline procedures don't enable them to do that. So if you look at slide 8, suspensions and expulsions. So we've got short-term suspensions, and those are, 10 days is kind of the big cutoff that you hear a lot. And so short-term suspensions aren't a change of placement. They can happen. It doesn't matter if it's a manifestation of the student's disability or those types of things. Serial suspensions. Now, these are really tricky and they're kind of hard to prove, and you've got to look at them on a case-to-case basis. But the idea is that if a student's being suspended so frequently, it's so disruptive to their education, it's so it's almost like they're not in the setting, and it starts to become a change of placement, because all of those, they're short-term suspensions, but the way they constitute a pattern of removal, that's something to look out for. In Oregon just passed more laws prohibiting suspensions quite a bit at the elementary level. So it's really hard to justify suspensions now at those really early grades. And that's for special ed and general ed students. Long-term suspensions and expulsions. Now, this is when you have more than 10 days. And once that happens, we need to conduct a manifestation determination. And the idea there is the behavior that the student's being suspended for a manifestation of their disability? And if the answer is yes, then we're not going to suspend that student. There's two clauses to a manifestation determination. The first one is, was the IEP implemented as written? So if we're not implementing the IEP the way it should be, then it's a manifestation of the disability. So we got to be really careful that we are implementing the IEP as it should be. And then the second one is that direct and substantial relationship to the student's disability. And this one can be really tough, especially since we've got a lot of students who have executive functioning deficits. And that's kind of the hardest one, because then it almost seems like any behavior the student does, they say, well, he's impulsive, and we know he's impulsive. And so those can be kind of tricky, because where's that line of personal responsibility? I know when I am doing manifestation determinations and I'm interviewing the student, it's a lot about, did you know what you were doing was wrong? Did you know that wasn't a good choice? And seeing if they had the knowledge and the skill about that. An interim alternative education setting. So as a special ed teacher, you kind of want to be tracking the suspensions of your students, particularly in small schools and small school districts, because they might not have a systematic way that that's being tracked. And the tough part is on day 11, you have to have students need to have access to their services on day 11. So on about day 8, you better have a plan in place in case they get a 3-day suspension, coming up, because on day 11, homebound instruction is not great. But on day 11, if that's our only option, we've got to be sending a speech path out to that student's home, which means we have to have a speech path to go do that. We need a special ed teacher to go out there, or we need to have an alternate setting that they can go to receive their services. And setting that up takes time. And so we have to have a plan for students when they start getting close to that 10-day mark, because on day 11, we have to be delivering services in an alternate education setting, and that takes time to plan. And your principals might be too busy to be thinking about this, so you'll want to think about that and kind of prompt them and help them with that. Okay. So proactively addressing behavior problems with students with disabilities. This is one of those things, and when we talk about manifestations and we talk about the responsibility of the school, if we know a student has certain behavior problems and we're not offering behavior supports, if we don't have a behavior support plan in place, if a student's being suspended to this degree, we should be doing an FBA. We should have a behavior support plan. We should be proactively tracking data and seeing what helps and what doesn't. Because again, the best place for kids to be, especially for students with disabilities, they really need to be in school. And so the more proactive we can be in giving those supports and having those interventions, the better it is for everybody. And it's the law. So, there we are. So slide 10. So school-wide discipline. This is about focusing on teaching appropriate behavior while preventing misbehavior from occurring. This is where you have things like if there's an assembly coming up, before the assembly, you go over what are the expectations for the assembly. You might even practice, what it would look like, how you show support for others, and those types of things. So schools need to develop school-wide discipline policies. They have to have rules and consequences. They have to have programming. So they have to have services for students with serious behavior problems. We need to be addressing that. If we know a student has a serious behavior problem, we need to be doing something about it and not just be like, oh, look, he blew out again. But there should be something that we're doing, and we should be tracking what we're doing, and we should be tracking if what we're doing is working. And we should be doing that at the individual level and at the school-wide level. If we have a school-wide positive plan in place, we should be tracking our behavioral data to see if those referrals are going down and how that's working. So implications for teachers and administrators. We need to develop school district discipline policies and procedures. We need to proactively address problem behavior. We need to provide behavioral interventions to teachers and training. If we have students who need to, at times, are a danger to self or others, we need to teach teachers how to protect themselves, protect the students, protect other students, those types of things. Document, especially with disciplinary actions, especially with suspensions. You want to have those very, very well documented. And part of this is really important because oftentimes what happens in court cases is people are looking back at things with 20/20 vision. And I always think it's really important to document what we know and what's happening and why we made the decisions in the moment. Because maybe later we'll learn that that student has aggressive tendencies or is depressed or, heaven forbid, if a student ends up bringing something dangerous to school. And sometimes people say, well, couldn't you have known that that was going to happen? But we didn't, given the information that we had then. So it's really important to document as much as possible about what's going on, why it happened, and why that consequence was chosen. And of course, evaluate the effectiveness of the interventions, both individually and at the school level. Because when we go back to, are we making reasonable attempts? Are we doing what we can do to keep that student in school? One of the best ways we can show that we're doing what we can do is to show that we're tracking data and we're changing and we're responding and we're trying new things. So in summary, schools and districts and the people that work in them have a legal responsibility to ensure safe, orderly learning environments, to develop school-wide discipline plans, to define, teach, and reinforce appropriate behaviors, to focus on positive, proactive models, and to have programs, and supports for students with serious behavior problems. Okay, thank you.